You mentioned funny pseudonyms, and something I was going to ask you about is there's a lot of astrologers writing anonymously or using funny pseudonyms in like the 1800s, and I was wondering if you know what the deal was with that.
I think it may have been partly reputational if they had professions where there was a kind of cultural and social stigma against astrology. I mean, particularly in London, I imagine in high London society and in scientific circles, probably astrology was frowned upon at that time. And there's some truth in what Keith Thomas said. Astrology did lose its reputation in parts of high society, but it doesn't mean it disappeared, of course. It just went underground more. And so I think there were certain people who practiced astrology in secret for that reason, but there may also have been legal risks attached. You probably are aware of the case of Thomas White, who is recorded as having met his death in around 1813, 1814, just 3 years after his great astrological work, The Celestial Intelligencer, was published in 1811, because he was entrapped by police officers, supposedly visiting his home on the Isle of Wight and asking for a reading for money, and or rather asking him to give them a reading and then throwing coins down, although he didn't want any money, but they entrapped him that way. And so he was sentenced to a year at Winchester jail, and it was in such squalid conditions in those days that he died before he was released. That is the story that's come down to us, and that was actually mentioned by a correspondent who wrote into one of Zadkiel's publications, The Horoscope, which was published in 1841, the monthly version. There was a weekly version in 1834, and he revived it 7 years later as monthly. It was one of those anyway that this letter was written in, telling the story of what happened to Thomas White. So I think there was a real fear that if you are identified as a practicing astrologer, you could be prosecuted, you could lose your freedom. And Thomas White wasn't the only case, of course. Something happened to Alan Leo that was very similar 100 years later, which probably hastened his death from a stroke, after he was trying to recover from a second sort of brutal court battle, and he die before he was 60.